Hi, I'm Jack from SIT, Singapore Institute of Technology, and in this video I'm going to talk about sprint planning, which is basically the start of any Scrum sprint cycle. So in sprint planning, the main goal is to move user stories from the product backlog to the sprint backlog. Okay, so a user story is a concise description of a requirement of the system, the first component being the description of the requirement. So this description always follows a set template in Agile, or in Scrum in particular. So this template has the words as a, I want to, and so that. So having these three things, we know who the exact user we are developing for, and what the user wants to do with this specific feature that you are developing, as well as what benefit it gives him if you have this feature in place. And next, we also have this part, which is the priority value. In this case, it is a must-have user story. It means that this must be developed as part of this product. In other cases, for example, below here, the priority is should have. So this, is not as important as the must-have user story. And other categories might be could have and won't have, for example. And the last component in a user story that should be there is an effort estimation. And in Scrum, it is known as story points, which is basically a numerical value to represent how much effort it is to develop this user story. And each user story that we choose, we need to determine a set of things to be confirmed into the sprint. So this set of things include the acceptance criteria, as well as priorities of each user story that we choose, and the effort that is going to be estimated for each user story. So now let's look at a set of videos taken from an actual software development project using Scrum to see how sprint planning can be applied. So in this first clip, we are looking at us setting up for the sprint planning meeting. So my role in this is actually the Scrum Master, and you can also see me putting up titles to demarcate the product backlog versus the sprint backlog. And the other guy that you are looking at the video, his name is Kerbun, and his role is the product owner. So what he's doing is that he's putting on story cards, which are basically printed versions of the user stories on the wall. So after we are done setting up the environment, we are ready to start the sprint planning meeting. And basically this is nothing more than me as the Scrum Master telling everybody that this is the start of the sprint planning. But more importantly, also reminding everybody that we have a time box to keep to, which in this case is 2 hours. Okay, so over here we see Kerbun writing the sprint goal, which we need to establish before the start of the session so that everybody has a good idea of what user stories to choose that are important for this sprint. Once everybody is clear about the sprint goal, the developers would now choose appropriate user stories on the cards to be moved from the product backlog into the sprint backlog. And when they are doing that, the developers also need to confirm two things with the product owner. First, the priority value, and secondly, the effort estimation in terms of story points. So once each of the appropriate user stories are chosen and placed into the sprint backlog, one of the key tasks that the product owner has to do is to create a set of acceptance criteria. So in this video, you can see Kerbun actually writing down an acceptance criteria on an orange-colored post-it note. So these post-it notes would be placed beside each of the user stories that are chosen in the appropriate row. Now, the product owner and the developers have to decide on whether these acceptance criteria are appropriate for each one of the user stories. And this is important because at this sprint planning stage, they are supposed to agree on what it means for each user story to be completed. And this will be used again in the sprint review process, which is at the end of the sprint for all the stakeholders and the product owner to determine whether the developers have completed each one of these user stories. So once everybody agrees upon the acceptance criteria for each one of the user stories, now the developers have the role of creating sub-stories based on this acceptance criteria, as well as the descriptions on these user stories. So the reason for doing that is first to determine the feasibility of these cards based on the detailed development tasks that's supposed to be done from the developer's perspective, and then also to possibly break up larger user stories in case they are too big for a day of development. Then the last thing is also to facilitate effort estimation, because once you have all the subtasks created, then you have a better sense of how much needs to be done for each one of the user stories. Okay, so at this point we can see that there's a lot of aspects for each user story to be discussed and clarified. And so some discussions may take longer.
What is add remove row?
Let's say I upload a Excel file, right?
Yeah.
So it will show a list of like student ID, so I can remove their ID or add their ID.
To be honest, the system don't have any other info. They don't know who is the student. They just know the ID. Then they're like, okay, I'll give this ID, this survey. Yeah. If there is any adjustments to remove ID, of course you can delete
the survey and
re-upload. This thing is no problem if you want to be able to remove individually, but I just don't know how helpful it will be. So I'll defer to you all whether is it better to you all re-upload or what. Yeah.
Also, my thinking was actually when I press upload, it show on the table. Then the admin, right? I mean the designer will see who is going to be uploaded.
Yeah, but the list will be very long now, and then it may flood the entire UI. You
can use the pagination data table.
And so here is where the Scrum Master needs to step in and mediate the discussion in order to ensure that all these conversations are actually on the right track. Because the key role of the Scrum Master is actually to facilitate good Scrum practices, as well as prevent any distractions and, in the worst case, disasters. I guess it makes sense to see what you have uploaded, and you may want to adjust it.
Okay.
And so, as you can see here with my intervention, everything normally would end well, and we still love each other. Okay, so that was a depiction of a real sprint planning meeting that we did recently for a software development project. And in there we see the product owner, the Scrum Master, as well as the developers all coming together to craft a set of user stories which contain the description, the acceptance criteria, the priority, as well as the effort estimation. So with that set of user stories, those are then put into the actual sprint development in the next phase, in which we will do daily Scrum meetings every day. And these daily Scrum meetings will be explained in the next video.